The bullet hit the wall 3 inches from her head, and Amara didn't flinch. She simply turned, disarmed the man behind her in 4 seconds flat, and looked up to find Kang Min-ho staring at her like he'd just witnessed a ghost walk through fire. He didn't know yet that the woman he'd hired to be quiet, to be invisible, to be his shadow of a wife, had once been trained to kill. Welcome to Story World Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Seoul at midnight looked like a city built out of glass and secrets, and Amara had learned to move through both without leaving a mark. She stood at the edge of the penthouse balcony, wind pulling at the hem of her simple black dress, watching the lights blink across the Han River like a heartbeat she didn't belong to. 6 months. She had been Mrs. Kang Min-ho for 6 months, and in all that time, her husband had spoken to her exactly the way a man speaks to furniture he respects but does not love. Polite, distant, correct. She wasn't supposed to mind. This marriage had never been about love. It had been about her father's debts and his family's need for a foreign face to soften an image that had grown too cold, too calculating, too feared. Kang Min-ho, chairman of Kang Dynamics, was a man whose name alone could end careers with a single phone call. And Amara, quiet, curvy, careful Amara, had walked into his world like a woman carrying a secret so heavy it had reshaped the way she breathed. Nobody in Seoul knew that before she was Mrs. Kang, she had been Sergeant Amara Devereux, 29 kills confirmed, 3 governments who owed her favors they would never admit to owing. She had buried that woman the day she signed the marriage contract. Buried her the way you bury something you're not ready to look at, in a shallow grave, close enough to the surface that the smallest disturbance could bring her clawing back up. The next day, the disturbance came wearing a tailored suit and calling itself an accident. Min-ho found her in the private garden behind the estate, kneeling in the dirt, hands buried in soil up to her wrists, planting something she refused to name. He stood there for a long moment, arms crossed, studying his wife the way he studied hostile takeovers, searching for the weakness that would let him understand her. He had married a stranger. He had not expected the stranger to be interesting. "You garden," he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say that wasn't a question about her past, which he had learned through 6 months of silence that she would not answer. "It's the only thing that stays still long enough to let me think," Amara said without looking up. Her voice was low, unhurried, carrying the faint warmth of the American South even after all these years abroad. "Everything else in this house moves like it's afraid of me." Min-ho's jaw tightened. "Nothing in this house is afraid of you." "Then why does your security detail flinch every time I walk past?" She finally looked up, dirt smudged along her cheekbone, and something in her eyes, sharp, assessing, entirely too aware, made him take an involuntary step back. He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. He turned and walked back into the house, and Amara watched him go, her pulse steady, her hands trembling only slightly, the way hands tremble when a body remembers old instincts it was never allowed to fully forget. That evening, over a dinner neither of them wanted to eat, Min-ho's mother called. Amara listened to one side of the conversation, Korean clipped and formal, and understood every word though she had let her husband believe her fluency was only passable. It was a habit from her old life. Let people underestimate what you understand. It had saved her more than once. "My mother wants to meet you properly," Min-ho said afterward, setting his phone down with more force than necessary. "A dinner, formal. She wants to see the woman I married." "She wants to inspect the woman you married," Amara corrected gently. "There's a difference." Something almost like amusement flickered across his face before he smoothed it away. "You're not wrong." A few days later the dinner happened, and it went exactly as badly as Amara expected. Kang Soo-yeon, Min-ho's mother, arrived draped in silk and disapproval, her eyes cataloging every inch of Amara like she was pricing livestock. "You're softer than I imagined," she said in English, clearly meant as an insult. "I thought foreign women had more spine." Amara smiled, the kind of smile that had once made hardened men reconsider their life choices. "I have plenty of spine, ma'am. I simply choose when to show it." Soo-yeon's eyes narrowed. Min-ho, watching from across the table, felt something shift in his chest, small, unfamiliar, dangerous. His wife had just stood her ground against a woman who terrified boardrooms full of executives, and she'd done it without raising her voice. He found himself wanting to know more about the woman he'd married out of necessity, wanting it in a way that unsettled him. Later that night, long after his mother had left in a huff of expensive perfume and wounded pride, Min-ho found Amara on the balcony again, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill. "You didn't have to defend yourself tonight," he said. "I would have handled her." "I don't need handling," Amara replied, not turning around. "I've survived worse than your mother's opinions." "Worse how?" The question hung between them, sharp and curious. Amara's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, a flicker so brief he might have imagined it. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me." She turned then, and for one unguarded second, something old and tired and dangerous moved behind her eyes before she locked it away again. "Good night, Min-ho." She left him standing there, wind pulling at his jacket, wondering what exactly he had married. By the end of the week, Min-ho had become obsessed with the small mysteries of his wife, the way she never sat with her back to a door, the way her eyes tracked exits in every room she entered, quick and automatic like breathing, the way she moved through the house with a silence that seemed almost trained, deliberate, practiced 1,000 times over. He told himself it was simple curiosity. He was lying to himself, and some part of him knew it. The following morning, an incident at Kang Dynamics headquarters changed everything. A disgruntled former employee, recently terminated for embezzlement, walked into the executive floor with a gun and a grudge, and the building fell into chaos within seconds. Alarms wailed, security scrambled, and Amara, who had come to deliver lunch her husband had forgotten to eat, found herself standing 3 feet from the chaos when the man raised his weapon toward Min-ho's office door. She didn't think, she moved. In the space of 4 seconds, Amara crossed the distance between herself and the gunman, disarmed him with a precision that belonged to another life entirely, and had him pinned to the floor before the first security guard even rounded the corner. The gun skittered across the marble, and the silence that followed was the loud kind, the kind that swallows a room whole. Min-ho stood in his doorway, staring at his wife, who knelt over a subdued attacker with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before. Many times before. Her dress was rumpled. Her breathing was even. Her eyes, when they finally met his, held no fear at all, only the quiet exhaustion of a secret finally seen. "Amara," he said, his voice rough, disbelieving, "what are you?" She didn't answer immediately. Security swarmed in, taking the gunman into custody, and through it all, Amara stood slowly, smoothing her dress, composing herself back into the quiet woman she had spent 6 months pretending to be. But it was too late for that mask now, and they both knew it. "We need to talk," she said finally, "not here." That evening, in the privacy of his study, Amara told him the truth, or at least the parts of it she was permitted to tell. Special forces, black operations, a life that officially didn't exist on any government record, scrubbed clean and buried the moment she'd walked away from it 3 years ago. She didn't tell him everything. There were things she could never tell anyone, things that lived in her like shrapnel too close to the heart to safely remove. But she told him enough. Min-ho listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. When she finished, the silence stretched long and taut between them. "Why did you hide this from me?" he finally asked. "Because the moment people know what I am," Amara said quietly, "they stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as a weapon. I was tired of being a weapon, Min-ho. I wanted just once to be someone's wife instead." Something in his chest cracked open at that. Something he didn't have a name for yet. He crossed the room and for the first time in 6 months reached for her hand. "You are my wife," he said, low and certain. "Whatever else you are, that doesn't change." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected tenderness. She had braced for rejection, for the cold retreat of a man realizing he'd married a stranger built out of violence. Instead, his thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, and something in her carefully guarded chest began, terrifyingly, to thaw. The following weeks brought a shift neither of them acknowledged out loud. Min-ho began finding reasons to be near her. He would linger in the garden while she planted things she still refused to name. He would ask about her day with a genuine curiosity that unsettled her far more than his previous indifference ever had. Small acts of care began appearing without explanation. A specific blend of tea she preferred left steaming by her reading chair. A driver quietly instructed to take the longer route past the river because he'd noticed she liked watching the water. She noticed everything. It was impossible not to, given how she was trained. But she said nothing, because numbing it felt like inviting a danger she wasn't ready to face. The danger of wanting something this fragile, this easily broken. At a company gala 2 weeks later, Danger arrived wearing a different face entirely. A rival executive named Yoon Tae-sik, ambitious and cruel in the particular way of men who mistake charm for kindness, cornered Amara near the bar, his hand settling too familiarly at the small of her back. "The chairman's wife," he said, smiling with too many teeth. "I've heard interesting rumors about you. American, aren't you? Must be lonely, married to a man who's never home." "I manage," Amara said evenly, stepping subtly out of his reach. "I could keep you company," he pressed, closing the distance again. Min-ho wouldn't even notice. Across the room, Min-ho noticed everything. He was at Amara's side in 6 strides, his hand settling possessively at her waist, his eyes on Tae-sik carrying a warning sharper than any words could manage. "My wife," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "does not require company." Tae-sik held up his hands, retreating with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, but the damage had already been done in a smaller, more private way. Amara felt Min-ho's grip on her waist, possessive, tense, and something in her chest fluttered dangerously. Later that night, in the car ride home, the silence between them buzzed with something unspoken. "You were jealous," Amara said finally, testing the words. "I was protective," Min-ho corrected, though the tightness in his jaw told a different story entirely. "That's not the same thing." "No," he admitted, turning to look at her fully for the first time all night. "It is." The following morning brought its own catalyst, though neither of them saw it coming. A storm rolled through Seoul with a violence that knocked out power across half the city, and Min-ho, trapped at the estate with Amara and no staff able to make it through the flooded roads, found himself standing in candlelight watching his wife laugh, truly laugh, for the first time since he'd known her, as she attempted and failed spectacularly to cook dinner over a portable stove. "You're terrible at this," he said, unable to hide his smile. "I can disarm a gunman in 4 seconds, Amara shot back, waving a wooden spoon at him, "but cooking has always been my Achilles heel. Sue me." "I like this version of you," he said before he could stop himself, the words slipping out unguarded, honest. Amara's laughter faded into something quieter. "Which version is that?" "The one who isn't hiding," he said, stepping closer, the candlelight throwing gold across the sharp lines of his face. "The one who lets me see her." The air between them thickened. Amara's pulse, usually so disciplined, so controlled, began to race in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the man standing too close, looking at her like she was something worth discovering rather than something to be managed. "Min-ho," she whispered, a warning and an invitation tangled together in his name. He closed the distance slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. His hand came up to cup her jaw, gentle in a way that felt entirely at odds with the cold, calculating chairman the world knew. "I've spent 6 months trying not to want you," he admitted, voice rough. "I'm done trying." When he kissed her, it was like the storm outside had moved indoors, fierce and consuming and long overdue. Amara's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, every trained instinct that told her to guard herself dissolving under the heat of his mouth against hers. Thunder cracked somewhere over the city, and neither of them heard it, lost entirely in each other, in 6 months of careful distance finally collapsing into something neither could take back. What followed that night was not spoken of in words, only in the language of trembling hands and whispered names, and a vulnerability neither of them had offered anyone in years. By the time dawn broke gray and quiet over the storm-washed city, something fundamental between them had shifted, irrevocably, terrifyingly. Amara woke first, and panic set in before her eyes had even fully adjusted to the light. She lay there, Min-ho's arm heavy and warm across her waist, and felt the old fear rise up like bile. She had let herself be seen. She had let herself want, and wanting in her experience was the fastest route to losing everything. She slipped out from under his arm before he woke, dressed in silence, and was gone from the estate before the sun had fully risen, leaving nothing behind but an empty side of the bed and a note that said only, "I need time." Min-ho woke to an empty room and a cold, sick feeling settling into his chest that he hadn't felt since his father's funeral. He read the note twice, then a third time, jaw clenched so tight it ached. He was not a man accustomed to being left. He was even less accustomed to caring that he had been. He spent the morning in his study, refusing calls, staring at nothing, replaying the night before, searching for the moment he'd said or done something wrong. He found nothing. That was almost worse. It meant she hadn't run from something he'd done. She'd run from what she felt. By afternoon, his mother called, and rather than deflect as he usually did, Min-ho found himself speaking honestly for the first time in years. "She left," he said simply. Soo-yun was quiet for a long moment. "Do you love her?" The question landed like a physical blow. Min-ho opened his mouth to deflect, to deny, and found he couldn't. "Yes," he said finally, the word unfamiliar and enormous in his chest. "God help me, I do." "Then go get her," his mother said, her voice softer than he'd heard it in years. "Some women, Min-ho, run because they've never once been chosen. They run to test whether anyone will follow." Amara, meanwhile, had gone to ground in the one place she knew Min-ho's resources couldn't easily trace, a small safe house on the outskirts of the city that had belonged to a former handler, long since retired, who owed her a debt too large to refuse shelter. She sat by the window, watching rain streak down the glass, and told